Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's event. My name is Andrew Ashman. I'm from Barclays here in Singapore. I'm also the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at BritCham. We're delighted to welcome you to today's event, how to embed diversity and inclusion into your hiring process. This is a collaboration between the Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the Leadership, Talent and Professional Development Committee at BritCham. And it's been proudly supported by Barclays, the Chamber's DNI partner. We're absolutely delighted to be bringing this event to you today. It's a subject that's very close to the heart of the DNI committee. It's a subject we've discussed at length in committee because recruitment really is the bedrock of any company's DNI policy. If you're not recruiting diverse talent, you've got very little opportunity to promote diversity and inclusion within your organization. But we are all aware that the hiring process is sometimes flawed. We've all seen how elements of unconscious bias can impact hiring outcomes. And so the whole purpose of this panel is to debate how we can embed diversity and inclusion into the hiring process and how we can discover untapped potential as a means to improve and enhance our business's culture. We've got a very able panel to debate these tasks and answer these questions. And I'm delighted to hand over to Madeline Mystery, who will be the moderator for today's panel. Madeline's from Elwood Consulting and is an active member of the DNI committee at BritCham. So on that note, pass you over to Madeline.
Thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining us today. Our first speaker, Natasha Doctor, is currently Head of People at Deliveroo. She has over 15 years of experience in the region, particularly recently in terms of growing and scaling technology-aligned businesses. So again, Natasha, thanks for joining us this afternoon. I guess my first question for you is, what steps can a high-growth tech business take to embed D&I into its organisational culture?
Firstly, thank you, Madeline and the Chamber for having me on the panel today. Now more than ever, I think building diverse, equitable and inclusive teams is important, not just for the organization culture, but data has shown that companies that embrace D&I consistently outperform businesses that don't. D&I is also one of the most widely discussed topics within the tech industry today, right? You read about it all the time, you see it in the news all the time. And great strides have been made, but there is still work to be done. So first and foremost, embedding diversity, inclusion, and equity involves starting with an open mind and acknowledging that D&I initiatives are not a nice to have anymore, but a must have. The risks of not having a D&I strategy are manifold, including reputational damage, legal repercussions. And there are numerous examples out there of successful tech organizations who are faced with massive challenges due to issues of gender discrimination, sexual harassment, toxic cultures. We've all read about them. We've all heard about them, right? So that's why, these initiatives are no longer good to have. Secondly, having buy-in at the leadership level and making leaders active ambassadors of D&I initiatives, holding leaders and managers accountable through evaluation against goals. And finally, for me, this is really one of the most important ones, is education and awareness. Now, this is even more important for organizations that are operating at scale. Now, it is really about being intentional, about driving the D&I agenda and embracing change. Now, ongoing communications, so regular conversations with employees about D&I initiatives propels understanding, but also increases engagement with key programs. To talk about what we do at Deliveroo, firstly, we explicitly reflect our D&I commitment in one of our core values, which is, it's called We Celebrate Difference. And we firmly believe that diverse perspectives bring better outcomes, not just for Deliveroo, but also for its customers, its employees, and the wider ecosystem. One of the initiatives that we found really impactful is creating employee-led, we call them DIB groups, supporting racial equity, gender equality, wellness, and the LGBTQ+ community. Each of these committees drive initiatives to create a workplace that is deeply inclusive, transparent, and of course, fun to be a part of. So I think, just to summarize my answer, I think DNI initiatives and really building a diverse and inclusive organization is a long-term commitment that requires time, energy, and support from across levels within the organization.
Absolutely. And I think including D&I with that sense of fun is very, very either at Deliveroo or in some of the other organisations you've worked with, what are some of the barriers that you've faced in having a truly diverse and inclusive workplace?
That's a really good question, Madeline. There are multiple barriers to D&I which, if not understood and addressed, will derail any efforts despite really starting out with the best intentions. Now, the first barrier that I see is really viewing diversity as a single isolated construct. Now, diversity goes hand in hand with inclusion and equity. We could meet all of our diversity metrics, yet fail to create an equitable and inclusive culture and really an environment where employees feel like they belong, they are valued, and they are empowered. So all of these three things need to go together. Now, in high growth, fast-paced, fast-changing environments, it is very easy to put off or lose focus on D&I initiatives. Imagine a scenario where headcounts are doubling every few months. The focus is on building the product and employees are under enormous pressure at all times to deliver results. In such an environment, it is very easy to lose focus on hiring diverse candidates or even on employee well-being. It is only when there is a strong commitment to D&I that organizations will continue to forge ahead and deliver on their D&I goals. Now, another barrier that I see, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about it in this panel, is unconscious bias. Simply put, unconscious bias means that we automatically have a preference or an affinity to those who are familiar to us. This automatic stereotyping or judging can be a huge barrier to workplace inclusion and diversity efforts. These biases, are very difficult to address because we know that by nature they're unconscious, right? And therefore, they are hard to pinpoint, hard to control, particularly when operating in a fast-paced environment or under a lot of pressure.
Okay. And so what is your approach to addressing those?
Another good question. So I think the first one is by educating employees on the different types of unconscious biases and carefully considering decisions on areas like hiring, like promotions and so on. Companies can help minimize on unconscious bias as a workplace barrier to D&I. Now at Deliveroo, we run unconscious bias training for employees. We really see this as a learning journey. It's not meant to be a one-time initiative. It's not meant to be a checkbox exercise. And we continue to drive training adoption and design our development programs to embed learning. Really, when employees believe that they can be their true selves at work, only then are they likely to experience a sense of belonging, be actively engaged, more likely to share their ideas, and less likely to leave the organization or look for other opportunities outside the business. So for us, I think to answer your question, we really use unconscious bias, not just in our hiring process, but we really actively use it as a means to train managers and employees. At the same time, we try and embed this across all of the processes internally.
Yeah, so you're not just looking at D&I, but also really embedding that equity piece, which is so important. Have your approaches to D&I changed due to the additional challenges of the pandemic? Clearly, we're bombarded on a weekly basis about the challenges that particularly aligned to technology hiring based in Singapore, despite all the fantastic endeavours of the Singaporean government to retrain and upskill people. So have your approaches to D&I changed due to the pandemic?
Yeah, the pandemic has really brought to the fore discussions around D&I, around mental health, around hybrid workplaces. We all know, like each one of us today has coped in different ways over the last 18 months, with many of us juggling work while managing children, while managing pets or even families. So the move to a hybrid workplace has shifted priorities and is having an effect on D&I initiatives. So while hybrid workplaces provide flexibility, the reality is that those who continue to work remotely may miss out on crucial face-to-face interactions. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to these challenges. I mean, we must continue to listen to our employees, be adaptable, and consistently refine our approach. Now, some challenges from the hybrid workplace can be overcome by adopting simple ways or simple techniques. One is inclusive communication. So even after hiring is done, when people come into the business, when they interact with leadership, with their managers, it's really about creating a psychological safe, sorry, I can't speak, psychologically safe space for employees to speak, and also focus on well-being and leading with empathy. Finally, while we know that the pandemic has thrown up these extra challenges, it has also presented the perfect opportunities for leaders to commit to real, meaningful change in the D&I journey.
Okay. And one final question for you, Natasha. In your experience with Deliveroo, how has integrating D&I into talent management enhanced your organisation?
Yeah, so I truly believe that in order for D&I to be effective, it must be fully integrated into the organization's talent management strategies, and at the same time be flexible enough to evolve as the organization grows. Now, it starts with reviewing the talent management strategy to identify gaps and opportunities. Really start with the hiring practices and evaluate how D&I reflects in the overall candidate journey, like really starting from posting of those jobs, jobs that are worded inclusively, and really conducting bias-free interview processes. Now, to minimize bias, one of the organizations that I worked for in the past, also a tech business, was actually contemplating doing away with sharing of CVs with the interview panel and getting the interview panel to focus solely on the competencies of the role and evaluate the candidates' skills and conduct interviews without having these CVs. While this might sound radical, we all know that CVs are filled with bias, and blind hiring as a practice is now continuing to pick up pace. The next bit of the journey is really onboarding. Once employees start, making sure that the onboarding program accurately represents the company D&I vision. So really bringing employees into that D&I conversation early in the journey. And this is something that we are piloting at Deliveroo, really involving them from day one. The next bit is looking at our internal processes. I alluded to this in the last bit of the question. So a big part of ensuring fairness, equity, and equal opportunity in people processes is by ensuring that decisions are guided by a consistent method. Now at Deliveroo, we have a performance calibration process that checks managers' recommended ratings and ensures that they are applied consistently. The goal here is really to combat anything that influences ratings that is outside of performance. Finally, it is equally important to check the impact of these initiatives, and we do this by regularly engaging with employees. We have a monthly engagement survey, and that really creates for us a regular feedback mechanism. So, Madeline, just to wrap this one up, I think the onus of making a real impact on the D&I strategy lies with managers. Therefore, it is really important to provide managers with the tools, resources, and training that they need to effectively incorporate D&I principles as they hire new talent, as they complete performance reviews, as they help employees develop skills and recognize team members. And weaving different dimensions of D&I into the entire employee life cycle will absolutely drive higher rates of engagement and retention, and eventually lead to better results for the business.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. I particularly resonate with your comment on no resumes because as a recruiter of 20 odd years, I'm always very delighted when I can get people interviews without pieces of paper, because they are in fact people, not pieces of paper. Thank you very much. So passing over to Peter. Peter is president for EMEA in Keller. He has 20 years of experience within the construction space, and I'm delighted that he's being able to join us this morning. So Peter, our first question to you: how does Keller approach the training and development of your leaders with regard to DEI? I assume this is particularly interesting given your focus within the construction industry.
Thanks, Madeline, and hello to everybody on the call. Look, the construction industry is very heavily stereotyped, I guess. We have up to 10,000 employees at any time, and we operate in up to 50 countries at any time. And the stereotypes differ country by country as to who participates in the construction game. It's generally seen as heavy, dirty, labor-intensive work. But with the gains in equipment and safety standards crazy, I'm pleased to say there's very little manual physical labour these days. Whilst 70% of our staff will spend their time in the field, 30% are in air-conditioned offices, enjoying all of those benefits. So it's really okay. Our bigger problem is around the supply constraint in diversity. So we run diversity, equity, and inclusion in our business. And so we focus very heavily around the inclusion side of it to ensure that all of those precious staff we can get feel part of the business, feel valued in the business, and feel that their contribution is as equally rewarded and appreciated as anybody else. Then we have to look at sort of if we can keep all of our current employees happy, because they're usually the best referees for people wanting to come into the business and for the company. How do we look at the supply side? How do we attract more people into the industry? Because the construction industry is very under-resourced at the moment, and that's only going to get worse as we come out of COVID with the spending things that governments are going to put in place. So we look at how can we actually increase the number of people interested in the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, manufacturing type subjects to get us in at that high level. We fight against the high tech appeal type careers. And so we have to look at building up a resume of opportunity for people to join outside of those traditional stereotypes.
So are you looking at people at school level, or is it at university level, or is it a combination of the two? Because clearly not everybody leaving school does choose to go on to university. So are you aiming to target both groups and then offer them a long-term career within the organisation?
Yeah, we participate at all three levels. Generally, the school and the university is really an industry-wide generation, and we participate in. Our speciality is a small part of the construction sector, but the construction sector is made up of businesses that need to interact and interface with each other to be successful. So getting kids interested in the building industry at a very young age. I've often said that what we need is a good drama piece, like an LA Law or a CSI. It's very, very difficult to get 15-year-old kids to decide I want a career outdoors in the sun building stuff compared to the other options. But yeah, so we do have to focus on that. But more importantly for us is construction has become a much better paying profession than was ever perceived in the past. And so we're looking at people mid-career, changing their options, looking at moving into that. Again, that labour component of it's gone now. Technology is much more part of it. There's a lot more office-based work. And so we're getting a lot more influx of people from other careers outside of engineering participating in the business.
Okay. And so what impact do national and or regional cultural norms have on your approach? Clearly, you manage a huge region for Keller. Australasia, Middle East and Africa. You are obviously confronted with different challenges in different geographies. So how do you approach those differences?
Yeah, and this is why it's very important that we sort of start with inclusion, build on equity, and then head towards diversity. I guess when most people think of a diverse business and a fully functional DEI policy, they're thinking of it in a Western business, contemporary business context. So it's not very diverse to take that context and trying to apply it to some African nations, Middle East nations, South Asia, Latin America. So you have to be very culturally aware of what it is to be inclusive within that society, because it's very easy to let exclusion creep into your policy in order to try to capture inclusion under your Western policy. So we have to be very, very careful about that. But within each of those environments that we work in, we try to be the best that we can within those environments, driving towards our corporate policies, our corporate goals, but being very cognizant of the traditional cultural beliefs. And it's not our role to change those, and they will change over time. We'll participate in those changes as rightly be, but we're not the organisation to lead that. And this is a very touchy subject for some of our people.
Yes.
Our celebration as a corporation of Pride Day is not something that we can do in some countries that we operate in, where
Yes.
homosexuality is actually still illegal. So
yeah.
we have to. The cultural context is probably more important to us than any of the other contexts around DEI.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And for you, what will good look like if Keller can meet all your DEI aspirations? What does the future look like if you meet the DEI goals?
Yeah, the future aspiration again is to ensure that a diverse group of people from gender, from culture, from educational levels, sitting around a meal or a boardroom table, solving a contemporary issue problem, is the ultimate endpoint. The problem is we'll never know when we're there. It'll be a continuous journey. We'll continually, again, it's like our safety journey. We never know whether we're good enough or whether we're lucky enough. Again, with the diversity, we're going to have to continue to play that. But I guess what looks at a diverse business that is fully inclusive in Keller may be very different to what a diverse business that's fully inclusive in banking might look like. So, we don't want to fall into the trap of being pigeonholed into a textbook DEI. We want to take the lessons learned, the good practices, the ideals from a textbook DEI, and apply them into our cultural and our work environment to ensure that we achieve that inclusive nature that makes everybody feel appreciated and rewarded.
Yeah, and I think taking that approach is definitely the way forward, certainly in the small work I've done in this space. It seems that you can't just have an identikit policy that will suit all organisations operating in all countries. It's just not going to work. Thank you very much, Peter. I'm now going to hand over to Helen Maguire. Helen is the co-founder and CEO of Diversity. She has always been a proud advocate of diversity and inclusion, particularly focused on gender, and she's got a very unique perspective, having worked and lived in numerous locations and obviously working now with global clients. So over to you, Helen. Hello.
Hello, how are you doing? Thank you so much for having me on the session.
No, thank you. Thank you. So I suppose my first question for you, with your vast experience of this topic, what would you say are the key areas into which bias can creep within the hiring process?
Yeah, so I mean, the three key areas that we really look at Diversity, and for very good reason, is really across all 5 elements of diversity. So several of the speakers have mentioned ways in which they approach diversity and inclusion, and the fact that obviously it's different geographically, but essentially looking at 5 elements. So not just gender or race and ethnicity, but also things like disability, LGBTQIA+, where it's relevant, and age, of course, which is relevant in most societies. And we find that it's really useful actually to start with measurement. And the reason for that is if you don't understand how diverse you are as an organization to begin with, it's very difficult to understand whether you're making any progress. And it's very difficult to start setting goals around that as well. So what are the elements of diversity that you're specifically looking at? As several of the speakers have said, it's not always relevant across all elements of diversity and all geographies, but certainly if you can focus down on what those elements are for you. For gender, I would say for most companies, that's table stakes right now. So where else can you look to improve your diversity? And how can you start to measure that? Do you have that data internally? Do you need some tech to help you to understand that? Is that something that you need to take a step back on? to really get a wider view, and then obviously to set goals around that and to start tracking and measuring towards those goals so that you understand and can report on exactly how well you're doing across those elements of diversity. Secondly, once you understand where you want to get to, you need to understand how you're going to get there. So putting those strategies in place. And I think we've talked a little bit about starting at recruitment. I think Andrew mentioned at the very beginning that if you're not recruiting diverse talent, it's very difficult to create a diverse organization at all. So really hiring and sourcing is where that effort really begins. So how are you representing yourself as an organization when you go out into the marketplace? Talk about what you're doing, talk about the role, the team that person might be working for. How are you speaking to those individuals and those potential employees? How are you putting yourself across as a brand? So really that comes down to language, and not just language and structure in the way that you might phrase your job description or your job role, but also the language that you're using across your website, across your social media, across your communications in email, or perhaps on LinkedIn if you're reaching out to those people there. So checking that language for anything non-inclusive, for any bias, making sure it's directed and is speaking to the people that you want to attract into your organization. And you know, there is tech out there that helps you to do that. Diversity certainly does so. There are other ways of doing it. I used to spend hours rewriting job descriptions and roles for my previous business, so I know how onerous it can be, but it really does make a difference. And in fact, studies have shown that by rewriting job descriptions in a more inclusive manner can attract up to 70% more diverse candidates. So it's really a great place to start. I think then look at where it is you're putting those jobs out. Where are you representing yourself online and offline? Are you integrated into the communities that you wish to attract more of, those underrepresented groups that are out there? Are you just putting your jobs up on LinkedIn or relying on traditional platforms? There are so many niche job boards out there, from those with disabilities to younger grads, if that's what you're looking to attract. So look for those places that you can post those job ads that will help you to integrate into those communities a bit better. And finally, a couple of people have mentioned it, blind hiring, super important. However hard you try, everybody has unconscious biases. I have them, plenty of them myself. It's just human. It comes from your background and your society and everything about you as a person. You will naturally look for people who, seem a bit more like you, essentially. So blind hiring is super important. Get rid of the CV. I completely agree with that approach. Look at the skills that person has to offer. Don't look at how long they've been in the job, but look at how well they've done in that job. Ask for references, obviously, and get rid of things that can creep in. So anything that will identify names, locations. Geographies are often sometimes important. But even things like university names, school names, those kind of class biases and education biases can really creep in there. So again, anonymizing is extremely important. Again, diversity does that automatically. You can do it by hand. You can look at other ways of doing it for sure. But it really does reap rewards putting that effort in at the very beginning of the process.
Yes, and I would agree. I mean, I certainly spend quite a lot of time these days giving people insights into CVs. And the first thing I say is take the date off when you graduated, because it can be straight away become a no, which is unfair. And as somebody of a certain now, completely. I think possibly more resonates with me. How can biases change and evolve depending on the company size and location?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I like to think of it as a maturity index of DNI. And that looks different geographically and industry-wise and also size-wise of the business. From my experience, having lived and worked on kind of three sides of the globe, if you like, there's a fairly obvious urgency and demand around DNI in places like the UK and the US, let's say, where legislation has really come into play now. So I think, as Natasha was saying, DNI is not just a nice to have, it's a must have in those regions, and certainly other regions are catching up. And we see that every day at Diversely with the companies that we speak to, those that are quite happy to talk to us, of which there are many, and those that are happy to actually put some solid practices and strategies in place. I think as you kind of move across the globe, so I'm now based in the Middle East and obviously in Asia, you see certain companies taking the lead. That is usually the larger multinationals who are being mandated from their HQs, who usually sit in either the US or the UK or Europe. But also those smaller kind of scale-up businesses, those that are growing very, very quickly, those that need to attract essentially the best talent and to unearth talent out there that is difficult to find. They are starting to look at more diverse talent, attracting people that perhaps are being missed by those bigger organizations because of the biases in their processes. And they're finding some real diamonds, and I think those two elements are really coming together to push D&I forwards from a different perspective. They have different objectives and different ways of approaching it and different reasoning behind it, but essentially it's all giving underrepresented talent a better platform. In terms of the way in which you can help from a business perspective, I think even in your respective regions, if certain elements of D&I, and I think, Peter, you touched on this, where LGBTQIA+ is concerned, are, unfortunately not recognised, there is still ways for you to be allies to those people and to be advocates in small ways. I was speaking to a business, Shell, actually, a couple of weeks ago, and just things like having rainbow lanyards for your passes into work, or wearing a kind of rainbow badge that represents the fact that you're supportive of those communities without having anything concrete or specific in place, because obviously that would be inappropriate in those geographies, is really helpful. So understanding the candidate and the candidate experience becomes very important. So helping the candidate to understand that you are supportive, even if there are no specific legalities and strategies, let's say, around that. And that's something that I feel quite strongly about on hiring in general. Helping candidates to have a better experience will ultimately help you find more diverse talent for your organisation.
Absolutely, the good candidate experience, because then they will be more likely to refer people to you. And there's the old adage that good people tend to know good people, regardless of the skill set. So there we go. And one final question for you, Helen. Are there any tools you'd recommend that can help businesses improve their hiring processes, other than, of course, than Diversely?
Yeah, no, of course. I think the bigger point here really is around the element of human bias that we talked about at the beginning. However much training and support you give to your talent teams, the fact is talent teams change, right? So people leave and come into your organization all the time. It's not always possible to have the same level of understanding for every single person in the organization around what unconscious bias is, around how to recognize that, how to remove it from your processes. So using tech is a really helpful way to improve that, and also to help you to measure and track and improve the ways in which you're doing things. Yes, I mean, Diversely certainly does all of those things, but there are many other ways in which you can use tech to help. So for example, when you're looking at selection and hiring, that's often again where biases creep in. So how can you automate some of those processes? I'm not a huge fan of these kind of video platforms that score people. I think it makes people incredibly nervous. I prefer not to have my camera on when I'm interviewing candidates, because again, that is where human bias can creep in. But there are other platforms out there that help you to understand whether the person is a good fit for your organization. So Fingerprint for Success is one of those. They're based in Singapore, actually. We've used those for that method for some of our hiring. There's predictive hire, which is based in Australia, which helps you to understand your candidate better and whether they'll be a good fit for your organization. There are specific platforms like Adderface, for example. So if you're looking for tech talent, does that person have the right skills in order to meet what your organization needs? And that doesn't mean have they gone to the right university. It doesn't mean have they gone to university at all. It means can they do the job? So that extra layer of tech, let's say, or that extra layer of checking without humans coming into the process until the kind of end when you really need to, obviously, is super important. So I'd highly recommend checking out some of those platforms.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again for joining. And I appreciate you joining so early in your morning in Dubai as well.
That's
all
okay.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now moving on to Joanna. Joanna is Regional APAC for DNI and CSR from Fiserv. And I know because of our LinkedIn connection that she is certainly somebody who is a proud advocate for all things related to CSR. So my first question for you, Joanna, clearly in your role, Fiserv believe there is a key alignment between CSR and DNI. How can incorporate the two functions?
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, BritCham, for having me here today. So yes, there's definitely alignment between these two functions, CSR and DNI, which serve to complement one another. And there are definitely community elements around it in today's climate. As we all know, events of the past year, including the pandemic, social unrest within different communities, it's put a spotlight on companies as well as our CSR and DNI efforts, because people not only want to work for companies and know what they're doing, but they also expect to see real action in the community where they live and work in, and they have higher expectations. In my view, these expectations are here to stay. So at Fiserv, our giving back and diversity initiatives has to become ingrained in the way that the business operates. And we have a unique obligation to make a positive impact to help move the world forward together through intentional actions. So as a CSR professional who is driving DNI, I drive that from a community standpoint externally and internally from a DNI and employee engagement standpoint. So I think when you think about your company overall values and culture, what we stand for. At Fiserv, we celebrate originality and we will not tolerate any form of discrimination or racism. And this commitment to fostering a culture of DNI, it reflects that in our actions, demonstrated by our leaders who speak far louder than our words. And we also have an action plan, a CSR and DNI action plan that supports our diverse associates and communities. In the space of CSR, we believe that doing good is good business. So the CSR and DNI programs and initiatives, it becomes part of what we do, and it aligns, and become integrated in becoming part of our DNA. So, Madeline, to answer your question, there definitely can be connections and alignment between CSR and DNI. Okay, and I'm going to ask you a question that we hadn't discussed, but just out of interest, who selects the initiatives that you support? Do you ask all the employees to make suggestions or recommendations? Do you rotate those initiatives on an annual basis? Yes, definitely. So we do our employee engagement surveys as well to get feedback. I mean, getting feedback from your employees and recognizing what they want and the gaps in terms of their employee experience, and bringing all of those together to then identify the area focus from a CSR and a DNI standpoint. I think it's important because by involving all our employees, we are being inclusive as well. All right, perfect. And with this obviously key linkage between CSR and DNI in Fiserv, how do you feel that actually works as a mechanism around attracting and retaining diverse talent? Yes, we all know that people want to work for companies that celebrates originality, and people bring along with them different backgrounds, perspectives, skills, and experiences. So being a company that embraces diversity, right, we must be able to look across the entire organization to consider how our CSR and DNI initiatives can complement our talent strategy. And this is also on display across all levels of our company. within Fiserv. And if we think about DNI and the community partnerships, which is embedded in our CSR program, this linkage actually serve as a support mechanism in how we can attract and also retain talent from diverse populations. For example, if a company wants to be known as being an advocate for the specially abled communities and individuals, we can set up employee resource groups, which is focused in that area. And also from a giving back and a CSR employee giving perspective, building that strategic corporate partnerships with organizations, with non-for-profit organizations in this area, so that individuals can start to give back, and also the community will also recognize our brand as a company that supports their community. So, for example, at Fiserv, we have recruited diverse talents, especially abled associates,
which is fantastic and absolutely how it should be. And you just mentioned employee resource groups. So for organisations that don't have formalised D&I or employee resource groups, what's your advice for getting started? And how do you choose which initial employee resource groups to identify?
Yes, Madeline. I think there's a real opportunity to encourage and foster that sense of inclusion and belonging. And ERGs are a really great resource to elevate originality. So these are internal networks that can create positive impact both inside and outside the company. At Fiserv, we offer 8 unique ERGs designed to unite associates across the organization, regardless of who they are. They share a common background, identity, or affiliation. So ERG is a proactive approach whereby we can cultivate a inclusive and engaging work environment. So, for example, our Asian Leadership Council in APAC organize maybe cultural events to celebrate originality. We just did one event recently to celebrate the Mid-Autumn, a widely celebrated festival in Asia. And another point is how do we organize them is getting feedback from your employees to see where's the gap, as I mentioned earlier. Where do they want to be at? What do they want to see? So because each of them, they actually bring a rich and vibrant culture. So by marrying all these different backgrounds together, we can actually all learn and grow together, as a company. And I think it is also really important to offer D&I training, to educate and to coach and to create that environment, right, where they feel encouraged to bring their whole selves to work. At Fiserv, we have a curriculum dedicated to D&I, such as unconscious bias, and these trainings, they are accessible across the company anytime on our learning platform. So I think it's really looking at the culture of our organization, the population and your employees, and recognizing that there's these needs, and to get started.
Yes, and I think one of the key parts of inclusion is obviously for consultation. So it's something that you obviously do a lot at Fiserv. And one final question, Joanna, how will D&I and CSR work together in the future? Not necessarily just based on your experience in Fiserv, but what are you seeing in terms of, new developments within this space?
Yeah, so I think we are going to continue to see that these two functions evolving together, because more companies are believing that doing good is good business, and they are starting to take a holistic and consistent approach between their CSR and DNI programs and aligning it with their business objectives and their core values. So the employee engagement and employee experience, it would be from a holistic standpoint with these intersections, and also on an employee mental well-being perspective. I think there's a very strong connection between CSR, DNI, and the overlaying employee mental health and well-being. Also, just to add that more companies are publishing their reports, which is consistent of diversity, inclusion, and CSR. So I think that we're going to continue to see these two parallel tracks happening, where company, they start setting ambitious goals in this area. And just to add, for Fiserv, we hold matching donation campaigns to support external and diverse groups, non-profit organizations, in this, and internally, this is also harnessing the power and passion of our employees, right, as it relates to getting involved in things that they're passionate about.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks very much, Joanna, and thanks once again for taking part. I think some of the things that you have just raised lead very nicely to our final speaker for today, who is Bianca, who is Head of People Experience and Culture at KPMG. And my very first question for Bianca was that D&I is only part of your current remit. Do you feel more organisations will move to D&I being part of the overarching people experience and culture function? So I think that dovetails very nicely into some of the last comments that we had from Joanna. Over to you, Bianca.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Madeline. I was just taking notes of some of the points of all the other panelists have shared, and definitely agree with a lot of the sharing done in terms of, how to think about inclusion first, how to think about, different same problems, different solutions, and definitely, as Joanna was saying, how to, bring together the CSR, DNI, and well-being agenda. In my role in people experience, this is for me is a particularly a fantastic opportunity, because I've actually been the head of DNI for the past 15 years in several companies, and my view of, after doing that for more than a decade, was that D&I should not be sitting as a standalone function. Diversity and inclusion are lenses through which we look at human resources policies and procedures and processes. We should not be looking at diversity and inclusion as a separate discussion. It's not separate, right? Even when we talk here about recruitment, we're talking about recruitment. You shouldn't have a separate diversity recruitment. It's not like, oh, I hire, 90% of my team, I hire through normal recruitment, and then I want to do diversity recruitment, I do it separately. You obviously need to put focus into diversity and inclusion, but that focus should be throughout all of your human resources processes, from recruitment to onboarding to employee engagement, etc. So it's a way of looking at your data, is a way of increasing hopefully your productivity and efficiency as a company. But in my view, after many years of experience, it does not work if it sits in a box and is someone else's job. It needs to be everyone's job. It needs to be everyone in a team, everyone in the company should think that they are the heads of diversity and inclusion, because that should be a value and not a function in my perspective.
So what we're really talking about is a cultural overhaul, so that everybody embraces D&I as just part of something that we all do quite naturally. And I suppose the overall benefit of this is that we do then finally create that diverse, equity-based, inclusive culture that we all talk to and strive to. You've spoken to me before about D&I having to be part of an organisation's bigger picture of ESG. Why is this so important? And again, ESG is something that's increasingly, coming into people's dialogues and being put on people's radars. So why do you feel that this linkage is so important?
Yes. So, the ESGs is a hot word right now, but I think it's finally a hot word because we've been talking about this for at least a couple of decades now. And actually, they are all linked to the Sustainability Development Goals. And the Sustainability Development Goals, again, have been there for quite some time. We were supposed to achieve quite a lot by 2030, and we are a bit far from our goals. So I think as humanity, we need to start thinking about what do we want to achieve. And what ESG is bringing is rigor to that measurement, because we know that whatever we measure, it becomes a little bit more achievable and also it gets done, right? So as Joanna was mentioning, diversity and inclusion and CSR, they are part of the social component of ESG. But again, what it makes it, bringing ESG to the fore topic is that it makes it more measurable. So when we all said, oh, it's great, we all want to be inclusive. Okay, so show me. And again, it shows you the data behind it. So if you say, I want to be, carbon neutral by 2025, for instance. Okay, so show me how. Where are you? We should be doing the same around our well-being of our employees, around the inclusiveness of our culture, right? We should be measuring those things that we always thought was so hard to measure, but now are part of these corporate governance. The other part that is very important to think about is the E and the G part of the ESG, because we always talk about the S, because the social part has so much into it. But the E part is really important. The economic part is really important, because that is really how do we as companies, multinationals or small and medium companies, collectively impact and make economy more inclusive and sustainable. If we make economy more inclusive and sustainable, then again, we are giving more opportunity to diverse talent, we are giving opportunity to diverse entrepreneurs, we are investing in women-owned business, etc. Then the G part, which is the governance, which absolutely sits most of the time actually with human resources. I used to be a consultant in Mercer. We always talked before about, executive pay, and now it's being measured. So, the banks have been doing this for quite some time through their regulatory bodies. We as Big Fours and audit companies have been doing it as well for quite some time through our regulatory bodies. But now everyone will start to say, well, the governance part is really important. Not just what you say, but what you do, how you measure it, to the point of, we do pay equity. You not should only do pay equity, you have to do pay transparency. So we are moving to things that will be higher in terms of impact, because we are moving to measure things that we've been putting into decades of presentations into now, measurable outcomes.
Yeah, and I suppose it's that quantum shift from things being done as a box ticking exercise to actually living, breathing and believing it. And one final question for you. What would you say are absolutes for an organisation starting their DNI people experience journey, given your vast experience in this space? What are the absolutes, and how can people start off small?
Well, I think the absolute is to start. I think that because I think we can have a little bit of analysis paralysis, right? I think that we are living in a fantastic moment in history where we can try new things, because a lot of the stuff that we're doing have never been done before. So I have a lot of conversations with people that reach out to me and say, how do I start? And I always say, by starting, by the beginning. I think that that's the most important part, is for us to not say, I don't know this, or this is complex. Believe me, we will get it wrong. We will have to do it again. I think a lot of this is trial and error. And as Peter was saying, for instance, one country to the other is different, right? One industry to the other is different. How can I help, for instance, Peter in construction, where I don't have any, experience in construction, and I don't understand the talent pool? So I think a lot of it is listen to your people, number one. Listening is the number one thing you need to do. You need to understand, is this noise? Is this a real problem? Then go check your data, go verify, but don't look at just surface data, right? Look at your whole employee cycle. Don't look at just hiring data. Look at your attrition data, your promotion data. Look at how long people stay in roles. Look if you have internal mobility. Look if there are functions that are more appealing to diverse talent. Go do your data analytics homework properly and find the exact problem, because you can't have a blank solution for it. And I think, again, do a pilot for things. I am a big fan of, I think that nothing should be like financially, we should not be measured by quarters, but every project should be measured by quarters, right? We should always go back and say, did it work? It didn't work. It's okay, redo it. And if you listen to your employees and if you open up to them, and Joanna talked about employee resource groups, for instance, you will have a base of, just sound bites that will tell you, hey, it's not working. But you also have base to ask to co-create with you. You don't have to have all the solutions. You don't have to have all the answers. I think what employees want to see is that you're trying, and that you're trying for the right reasons, and that you're willing to fail and get back to it again.
Yeah, and straight away, the fact that you're listening and trying to include is the start of probably your journey. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bianca. Really appreciate you taking the time out this morning. Just before we conclude, I do have a couple of questions that I will just throw out to the panel as a whole. The first question is, do you have tips on how to set goals? What do we benchmark against? Other regions or other, it says forms, I'm not too sure. I guess how do we go against benchmarking ourselves, and how do we set goals for ourselves within this space? Anyone?
Yeah, happy to take this if that's useful.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I think benchmarking is always quite an interesting one, because there are several different ways of approaching it. Obviously, you can benchmark in terms of your industry, you can benchmark in terms of the business size, your geographical location, but also you can become a lot more granular than that, because actually if you look at the data as a whole, as a business, you may look quite diverse, but actually when you drill down into specific departments, as we all know, tech often suffers from a lack of female representatives, for example, then it looks different according to which department you're in. I think, on a manual basis, some businesses have a way of being able to pull this data out of their HR systems, but obviously there are often issues around GDPR and PDPA and data compliance and those kind of things. You can look at public data, which will give you a sense of where you are and where you should be. So LinkedIn is quite a good source of that sort of data. Or again, you can use tech that can help you to plug in to specific data that either you might have, if your employees have given you permission to do so, or public data itself. So I think that understanding where you are at the very beginning is super important. In terms of then setting goals around that, it again comes down to what's the most important element of diversity for you as a business. Obviously, not all elements will be relevant, but where do you focus first? Where do you see the biggest opportunity, the lowest hanging fruit, essentially, to make gains and impact on your internal diversity? And you can't really do that without understanding where you are at the very beginning. But certainly, as I said, using that public data around LinkedIn will give you some of those benchmarks to work on if you're willing to put some of the effort in, or obviously use tech to help you to do so.
Madeline, thank you very much. I thought that was an excellent debate, an excellent discussion. It's pretty clear that despite the diversity that I saw across the sectors represented on the panel, we're all facing common issues in terms of hiring and embedding diversity into our businesses. But it's also clear that there's a common goal and common hopes and aspirations. So I feel that the panel really helpfully debated the importance of hiring diversely to really create that feeling of inclusivity within teams and within businesses. So thank you to all the panelists, a great discussion, some really interesting viewpoints. Also a big thank you to Madeline. I know you put a lot of work in specifically to get this panel arranged for today. Thanks for all your efforts putting together the questions and getting speakers together. So thanks for all your work there. And thank you to BritCham. Sabina, Lucy and Helen have all been very instrumental in putting together today's event. So thank you to the BritCham team. Excellent as always. We do have some upcoming events. I think we're going to see on the screen shortly. There are some upcoming events. Please take a note of those and sign up for them. It is important to get good attendees, and it will keep momentum going with the BritCham events. So please do sign up for the events on the screen. We're also going to have a survey after this event. So please do fill it out. Give us your feedback. Let us know what you thought of today's panel discussion, what we did well, what we can do differently, and what you want to see in the future. All feedback is appreciated. And on that note, I'll close by thanking the attendees, the audience. Thanks for joining us today. Your constant support is very much appreciated for DNI events. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you at the next event.